Chapter 7. A few days later, Kristin went to the pine woods with some of the nuns and lay sisters to gather moss for green dye. This moss was somewhat hard to come by, growing most on wind-fallen trees and dry branches, so the women soon scattered through the woods and lost one another from sight in the fog. For some days now this unusual weather had held, windless with a thick mist that showed a strange leaden blue out over the sea and away against the hillsides, when now and again it thinned so much that the eye caught glimpses of the country round. Between whiles it thickened to a drizzling rain. Then again it lightened so much that a whitish patch showed where the sun hung amid the towering mists. But there brooded always a strange heavy warmth, as of a bathhouse, that was unusual down here by the fjord, especially at this time of the year. It was 2 days before Nativitas Mary, so that all folk talked of the weather and marvelled what it might mean. Kristin sweated in the lifeless damp heat, and the thought of this tidings that she had heard of Nakvi weighed upon her breast. She was come down to the skirts of the wood, to the log fence by the path up from the sea, and as she stood there scraping moss from the fence, Sira Eilif came riding homewards through the fog. He stopped his horse and said some words of the weather, and so they fell in talk. Then she asked the priest if he knew anything of this matter of Nakvi, though she knew it was in vain, for Sira Eilif ever made as though he had no knowledge of the inside affairs of the Tautra cloister. "I think, Kristin, you need have no fear that it will hinder his coming hither in the winter, this mischance," said the priest. "It is that you are afraid of, perhaps?" "It is more than that, Sira Eilif. I am afraid Nakvi never was meant to be a monk." "Think you that you dare judge of such things?" asked the priest, bending his brows. He lighted down from his horse, bound it to a fence log, and leaned over the fence, gazing fixedly and searchingly at the woman. Kristin said, "I fear it is hard for Nakvi to bow beneath the rule of the order, and he was so young when he withdrew from the world he did not know what he was missing and didn't know his own mind. All that happened in his young days, the loss of his father's heritage, the sight of the discord between his mother and father that ended in Erland's death, it so affected him that he lost all heart to live in the world. But I never saw that it made him godly." "You could not? It may well have been as hard for Nicolaus as for many another good monk to bow beneath the order's rule. He is hot of mood and a young man. Too young, perhaps, to have understood, before he turned his back on the world, that the world is as hard a taskmaster as any other lord, and in the end a tyrant without mercy. Of that I think you yourself can judge, sister. And if so it be that Nakvi entered into the cloister more for his brother's sake than from love for his Maker, none the less I don't believe that God will let it go unrequited that he took up the cross for his brother's sake. God's mother, Mary, whom I know that Nakvi honoured and loved from his boyhood up, will surely show him clearly one day that her son came hither to this earthly home to be his brother and bear the cross for him." The horse whinnied with its nose against the priest's breast. He caressed it while he said, half to himself, "From his childhood up, my Nicolaus had a wondrous gift for loving and of suffering. I think that he should be right well fitted for a monk. But you, Kristin, he said, turning to the woman. You should have seen so much now, I think, that you might trust in God Almighty with a surer trust. Haven't you understood yet that he bears up every soul, so long as the soul does not let go its hold on him? Do you think, woman, child that you are, still in your old age, that it is God punishing the sin, when you must reap sorrow and humiliation because you followed your lusts and your overweening pride over paths that God has forbidden his children to tread? Would you say that you had punished your children if they scalded their hands when they took up the boiling kettle you had forbidden them to touch? Or if the slippery ice broke under them that you had warned them not to go out upon? Have you not understood, when the brittle ice broke beneath you, that you were drawn under each time you let go of God's hand, and you were saved from out of the deep each time you called on him? Was not the love that bound you and your father in the flesh together, even when you defied him, and set your wilfulness against his will? Was it not a comfort and a solace none the less when you had to reap the fruits of your disobedience to him? Have you not understood yet, sister, that God has helped you every time you prayed, though you prayed half-heartedly and with feigning, and helped you much beyond what you prayed for? You loved God as you loved your father, not so hotly as you loved your own will, yet none the less so that you ever sorrowed much when you forsook him, and therefore his mercy towards you suffered good to grow, amidst the evil harvest you must needs reap from the seeds of your stubborn will. Your sons, 2 of them he took to himself while they were innocent little children. For them you need have no fear. And the others have turned out well, even if they have not turned out as you would have had them. Doubtless Lavrans thought the same of you. And your husband, Kristin, God be merciful to his soul. I think you have blamed him in your heart early and late for his reckless unwisdom. Yet I think it would be much harder for a proud woman to remember that Erlend Nicolausen led you with him through shame and deceit and blood-guiltiness, if you had seen but once that the man could do nothing with cold contrivance. And almost, I believe, too, it was because you were steadfast in anger and hardness as in love, that you were able to hold Erlend fast for so long as you both lived. With him it was out of sight, out of mind, with everything else but you. God help Erlend. I am afraid he never had the wit to know true repentance for his sins. Yet did your husband repent and sorrow truly for his deeds, wherein he sinned against you? That lesson, we may dare to trust, has profited Erlend now that he is dead. Kristin stood still and silent. Neither did Sira Eilif say any more. He loosed the reins, gave her a "Peace be with you," mounted his horse and rode away. When, a little after, she came back to the cloister, Sister Ingrid met her at the door with word that one of her sons was come to greet her. Skule, he called himself. He was at the parlour gateway. He was sitting talking with his boatfolk. He sprang up when his mother came to the door. She knew her own son by the quick nimbleness, the small head borne high above broad shoulders, the long-limbed, slender form. Beaming with joy, she went towards him, but she stopped suddenly and caught her breath at the sight of his face. Oh, who had done this to her fair son? His upper lip showed as though kneaded out thin. A blow must have crushed it, and afterwards it had grown together flat and long and misshapen, barred with a network of white scars. It had left his mouth twisted and awry, fixed in what seemed a sneering grimace, and the bone of his nose had been broken and had set again crooked. He lisped a little when he spoke. He was missing one front tooth, and another was blue-black and dead. Skule reddened under his mother's gaze. "I think that you don't know me, mother." He laughed a little and passed a finger over his lip. It was not sure whether he was pointing to his blemish or whether it was but a chance movement. "We have not been parted that long, my son, that your mother should not know you again," Kristin answered calmly, with an untroubled smile. Skule Erlandson was come 2 days before with a light sloop from Bjorgvin, with letters from Bjarne Erlingsson for the Archbishop and the Treasurer of Nidaros. Later in the day, mother and son walked in the garden beneath the ash trees, and now that they were alone, he gave his mother the news of his brothers. Lavrans was still in Iceland. His mother did not know that he had gone thither. "Aye," said Skule. He had met his youngest brother in Oslo the winter before, at the gathering of the nobles. He was with Jamelt Halvardsson. But, as she knew, the boy had always had a longing to go abroad and look about him in the world, and so he took service with the Bishop of Skalholt and sailed away. He himself had gone in Sir Bjarne's train to Sweden, and thereafter to the war in Russia. His mother shook her head gently. She had known nothing of that either. Skule had liked the life, he said, laughing. It had given him his chance to greet the old friends his father spoke so much of, Karelians, Ingrians, Russians. No, that brave scar of honour was not won in war. He laughed a little. It was in a fight. The fellow that gave it to him would never have need now to beg his bread. More of that, or of the war, Skule seemed to have little mind to tell. Now he was captain of Sir Bjarne's horsemen at Bjorgvin, and the knight had promised to get back for him some of the manors his father had owned in Orkladal that were now under the crown. But Kristin saw that Skule's great steel-grey eyes took on a strange dark look as he said this. "You don't think you can put much faith in such a promise?" asked his mother. "No," Skule shook his head. "The deeds are even now being drawn up. Sir Bjarne has kept all he promised when I took service with him. He calls me kinsman and friend. Almost I have the same place in his household that Ulf had at home with us." He laughed, and the laugh became his marred face ill. But he was the comeliest of men in bodily form, now that he was full grown. He wore garments of a new-fashioned cut, tight hose, and a small, close-fitting kotari that barely reached to the middle of his thigh, and was buttoned with small brass buttons all down the front. It showed up in almost an unseemly way his body's supple strength. He looked as though he went about in his undergarments, thought the mother. But his forehead and his comely eyes were not changed. "You look as though something were weighing on you, Skule," the mother ventured. No, it was but the weather," he said, shaking himself. There was a strange red-brown glow in the fog as the hidden sun went down. The church stood out above the garden treetops, strange and dark, melting into the dull red mist. They had had to row the whole fjord from the very mouth, it was so calm, said Skule. Then again he shifted a little in his clothes, and began to speak once more of his brothers. He had been on an errand south in the land for Sir Bjarne this spring, so he could give her fresh tidings of Ivar and Gaut, for he had ridden up overland and made his way across the fells from Vagar home to the west country. All was well with Ivar. They had 2 little sons at Ronheim, Erland and Gamal, comely children. But at Jorengard I chanced upon a christening ale, and Jofrid and Gaut thought, as you were dead to the world now, they might name the little maid after you. Jofrid is so proud that you are her mother-in-law. Oh, you laugh, but now that you are not to dwell under one roof, be sure Jofrid knows well it has a brave sound when she talks of my mother-in-law Kristin Lavransdatter. But I gave Kristin Gautersdatter my best finger ring, for she has such winsome eyes. Almost, I think, she will be like you. Kristin smiled sadly. Soon you will be making me think, my Skule, that my sons think me as great and good as old folk are wont to be, once they are beneath the sod." "Don't speak that way, mother," said the man with a strange vehemence. Then he laughed a little. "You know well that all we brothers, ever since we were breeched, thought you were the bravest and most high-minded of women, though you clinched us full tightly under your wings many a time, and we flapped back, perhaps, somewhat hard ere we escaped from the nest. But it has proved, sure enough, that you were right in thinking Gout the one of us brothers that was born to be a chieftain," he said, laughing aloud. "No need to mock me for that now, Skule," said Kristin. And Skule saw that his mother flushed with a young, tender red. At that he laughed all the more. "It's true, my mother. Gout Erlendsson of Jorengard is grown a mighty man in the northern dales. This theft of his bride brought him such renown." Skule laughed loudly, with the laughter that so ill became his ravaged mouth. "They sing a ballad of it, aye, they sing now that he took the maid with iron and with steel, and he fought her kinsman 3 livelong days in the mountain, and the feast that Sir Sigurd held at Sundbu, and where he made peace between the kinsmen with silver and with gold, and for that too Gout gets all the honour in the ballad. And it seems to make no matter that it is all a lie. Gout rules the whole parish and somewhat beyond, and Jofrid rules Gout." Kristin shook her head with her little sad smile, but she grew young of face as she gazed on Skule. Now it seemed to her that he was most like his father. After all, the young warrior with the ravaged face had the most of Erlend's gallant mettle, and that he had so early had to take his fate into his own hands had given him a cool firmness of spirit that filled his mother's heart with a strange security. With Sira Eilif's words of the day before in mind, she saw all at once, fearful as she had been for her headstrong sons, and hard as she had often laid hand upon them by reason of her dread, yet she would have been much less content with her children had they been meek and unmanly. Then she asked again and again of her grandson, little Erlend, but Skule had hardly noticed him, it seemed. He was strong and comely, and was wont to have his way at all times. The uncanny glow in the fog, as of clotted blood, faded away. The dark was falling. The church's bells began to ring. Kristin and her son rose. Then Skule took her hand. "Mother," he said in a low voice, "do you remember that I once lifted my hand against you? I threw a bat at you in anger, and it struck you on the brow. Do you remember that? Mother, while we two are all alone, tell me that you have forgiven me." Kristin drew a long breath. Yes, she remembered. She had bidden the twins go on an errand up to the sæter. But when she came out into the courtyard, the horse was there, grazing, with the pack saddle on its back, and her sons running about and playing with a ball. When she chid them angrily for this, Skule flung the bat from him in a towering rage. But she remembered best what came after. How, as she went about after, with one eye quite closed by the swelling of the lid, the brothers looked at her and at Skule and shrank from him as though he were a leper, though Narkvi had beaten him mercilessly first. And Skule wandered away and sat boiling with defiance and shame under a hard, scornful mien. But when in the evening she was standing putting off her clothes in the dark, he stole up to her, said nothing, but took her hand and kissed it. And when she touched his shoulder, he cast his arms about her neck and pressed his cheek to hers. His was cool and soft, and still a little rounded. She felt it was a child's cheek still. He was but a child after all, this headstrong, fiery youth. "That have I, Skule, so fully, that God alone knows. For I cannot tell you how fully I have forgiven it you, my son." She stood a moment with her hand on his shoulder. Then he grasped her wrists, gripped them so tight that she winced with pain. And the next moment he flung his arms about her with the same passionate, fearful, bashful tenderness as that other time. "My son, what ails you?" whispered the mother in fear. She felt in the dark that the man shook his head. Then he let her go, and together they went upward to the church. During the Mass, Kristin called to mind that she had forgotten to bring in blind Lady Arsa's coat from where they had sat together on the bench outside the priest's door that morning. After the service, she went round to fetch it. Under the archway stood Sira Eilif, lantern in hand, and Skule. "He died as we came alongside the wharf," she heard Skule say, in a strangely wild, despairing voice. "Who?" Both men started violently when they saw her. "One of my shipfolk," said Skule low. Kristin looked from one to the other. At the sight of their blank, strained faces in the lantern's glimmer, she broke unwittingly into a little cry of fear. The priest set his teeth in his underlip. She saw that his chin quivered a little. "It were best, my son, you should tell your mother. Better that we all make ready to bear it, if it is God's will that we too shall be awaked by so hard a—" But Skule uttered a kind of groan and said no word, and on that the priest spoke. "Pestilence has come to Bjorgvin, Kristin. The great and deathly sickness that we have heard about, that is laying waste the lands in the whole world." "The Black Death?" whispered Kristin. "It won't help to try to tell you how things were in Bjorgvin when I sailed from there," said Skule. "No one can know if they haven't seen it. At first Sir Bjarn took the hardest measures to quench the fire when it broke out, away in the houses around John's cloister. He would have cut off the whole Nordnes from the town with the chain of his men-at-arms, though the monks of the Michael cloister threatened him with the church's ban. There came an English ship that had the pest aboard, and he would not suffer them to unload the lading or to leave the ship. Every man on the sloop died, and then he had her scuttled. But some of the wares had already been brought to land, and some of the burghers smuggled more ashore one night. And the friars of the John's Church stood to it that the dying must have ghostly comfort. Then folk began to die throughout the whole town, so it was useless, we saw. Now there is not a living soul in the city save the bearers of the dead. Every one flees the town, but the pest goes with them." "Oh, Jesus Christus! Mother, do you remember the last time it was lemming year at home in Sill? The throngs that rolled all along the roads and paths? Do you remember how they lay and died in every bush and rotted and poisoned every runnel with stench and festering foulness?" He clenched his fists. His mother shuddered. "Lord, have mercy on us all! Praise be to God and Mary Virgin that you were sent hither even now, my Skule." The man ground his teeth together in the dark. "That's what we said, my men and I, the morning we hoisted sail and stood down Vargan out to sea. When we were come north to Moldo Sound, the first one fell sick. We bound stones to his feet and a cross upon his breast when he was dead, vowed a mass for his soul when we came to Nidaros, and cast his body into the sea. God forgive us. We put into shore with the next two and got them help for their souls and Christian burial. For it is useless to flee from fate. The fourth died as we pulled into the river, and the fifth last night." "Do you need to go back to the town?" asked his mother a little later. "Can you not stay here?" Skule shook his head with a joyless laugh. Soon, I think, it will not matter at all where you are. Useless to be afraid. A man in dread is half dead. But I wish I was as old as you are, mother. No one knows what they are spared who die young, said his mother low. Be still, mother. Think about the time when you yourself were only 23 winters old. Would you have missed the years you have lived since? 14 days later, Kristin saw for the first time one sick of the plague. Rumour that the pest was raging in Nidaros and spreading through the countryside had come to Rissa. How, it was not easy to understand, for folks kept in their houses, and every man fled to the woods or thickets if he saw an unknown wayfarer on the road. No one would open his door to stranger folk. But one morning 2 fishermen came up to the cloister bearing a man between them in a sail. When at daybreak they came down to their boat, they had found a strange bark at the wharf, and in its bottom lay this man, senseless. He had found strength to make his boat fast, but not to get out of it onto land. The man had been born in a house owned by the cloister, but his kindred had all left the countryside. The dying man lay on the wet sail in the middle of the grass-grown courtyard. The fishermen stood afar off, talking with Sigrid Undset. The lay sisters and the serving women had fled into the houses, but the nuns stood in a cloister at the door of the convent hall, a throng of startled, trembling, despairing old women. Then Lady Ragnhild stepped forth. She was a little thin old woman, with a broad flat face and a little round red nose like a button. Her great light brown eyes were red-rimmed and always watered a little. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, she said in a clear voice, then gulped once. Bear him into the guest-house. And Sister Agatha, the eldest of the nuns, elbowed her way through the throng and, unbidden, went with the abbess and the men who bore the sick man. Kristin went in thither late at night with a remedy she had made ready in the pantry, and Sister asked if she would stay there and tend the fire. She thought that she should have been hardened. Well used as she was to births and deaths, she had seen worse sights than this. She strove to think of all the worst she had seen. The plague-stricken man sat upright, for he would choke with the bloody spittle that he brought up at each coughing fit. Sister Agatha had slung him up in a band passed across his lean, yellow, red-haired chest, and his head hung forward. His face was leaden grey-blue, and fit on fit of shivering shook him. But Sister Agatha sat calmly saying over her prayers, and when the cough took him, she rose, put one arm about his head and held a cup below his mouth. The sick man roared aloud in his agony, rolled his eyes fearfully, and at length thrust a black tongue far out of his gullet, while his lamentable cries died away in pitiful groaning. The nun emptied out the cup into the fire, and while Kristin threw on more juniper, and the wet branches first filled the room with a stinging yellow smoke, and then burst hissing into flame, she saw Sister Agatha settle the cushions and pillows under the sick man's back and armpits, wipe his face and cracked brown lips with a vinegar water, and draw the fouled coverlid up about his body. It would soon be over and done, she said to Kristin. He was cold already. At first he had been as hot as fire, but Sigrid Undset had prepared him already for his going. Then she sat down beside him, thrust the calamus root into its place in her cheek with her tongue, and fell again to prayer. Kristin strove to overcome the fearful horror that she felt. She had seen folk die a harder death, but it was in vain. This was the plague, a chastisement from the Lord for all mankind's secret hardness of heart, of which he alone had knowledge. She felt as if she were rocked giddily on a sea, where all the bitter and angry thoughts she had ever thought towered up like one huge wave amid 1,000, and broke in helpless woe and lamentation. "Lord, help us, for we perish." Sira Eilif came late in the night. He chid Sister Agatha sharply that she had not followed his counsel to bind a linen cloth dipped in vinegar over her nose and mouth. She mumbled testily that it was of no avail, but both she and Kristin had now to do as he bade them. The priest's quietude and steadfastness put some measure of courage into Kristin, or awoke a feeling of shame. She ventured out of the juniper smoke and began to help Sister Agatha. A choking stench came from the sick man that the smoke availed nothing to deaden. Filth, blood, sour sweat, and a noisome smell from his throat. She thought of Skule's words about the lemming swarm. Once more there came upon her the awful longing to fly, though she knew there was no place where one could flee from this. But when once she had taken heart of grace and touched the dying man, the worst was over, and she helped as well as she might until he had breathed his last. He was black in the face already when he died. The nuns walked in procession with the holy relics, crosses and burning tapers round the church and the cloister hill, and everyone in the parish who could walk or crawl went with them. But not many days after, a woman died nearby at Stroman, and then the deadly sickness broke out at a stroke on every hand throughout the countryside. Death and horror and direst need seemed to bear away the land and its folk into a timeless world. It was not more than a few weeks that were gone by, if one were to reckon the days, and already it seemed as if the world that had been, before pestilence and death stalked naked through the land, was fading from folks' memories, as a sea-coast sinks when one stands out to sea before a rushing wind. It was as though no human soul could keep in memory that once life and the daily round of work had seemed sure and near, death far away, or had the power to conceive that so it would be again, if so be all men did not die. "But probably we shall all die," said the men who came to the cloister with their motherless little ones. Some said it with dull, hard faces, some with weeping and lamentations. They said it when they fetched a priest to the dying. They said it when they bore the corpses to the parish church down the hill and to the graveyard by the cloister chapel. Often the bearers themselves must dig the grave. Sira Eilif had set the lay serving men, those that were left, to work at saving and garnering the corn from the cloister's fields. And wherever he went in the parish he admonished the folks to get their crops housed and to help one another to care for the cattle, so that they might not perish in the dearth the plague was like to leave behind when it had spent its rage. The nuns in the cloister met the visitation at first with a kind of bewildered calm. They settled down for good in the convent hall, kept a fire blazing night and day in the great masoned fireplace, slept there, and took their food there. Sira Eilif counselled that great fires should be kept up in the courts and in all the houses where there were fireplaces, but the sisters were afraid of fire. They had heard so many tales from the oldest sisters of the burning of the convent 30 years before. Meal times and working hours were no longer kept, and the many offices of the sisters could not be kept apart by reason of the many children who came from outside, praying for food and help. Sick folk were brought in. These, for the most part, were well-to-do folk who could pay for a gravestead in the cloister, and for masses for their souls, or the poorest and loneliest of the poor who could get no help at home. Those of a middle station lay and died in their own houses. On some manors, every human being died, but amid all this, the nuns still managed to keep up the hours of prayer. The first of the nuns who fell sick was Sister Inga, a woman of Kristin's age, near 50 years. But nonetheless she was so afraid of death that it was horrible to see and hear her. The shivering fit came upon her in the church during Mass, and she crept on hands and knees, shaking and with chattering teeth, praying and beseeching God and Mary Virgin for her life. Before long she lay in a burning fever, groaning and sweating blood from all her body. Kristin's heart shuddered within her. Doubtless she too would be as wretchedly afraid as this when her time came. It was not only that death was sure, it was the awful horror that clung about death from pestilence. Then Lady Runhild herself fell sick. Kristin had wondered a little that this woman had been chosen to an abbess's high office. She was a quiet, somewhat peevish old woman, unlearned, and it seemed lacking any great gifts of the Spirit. But when death laid his hand upon her, she showed she was in truth a bride of Christ. Her the sickness smote with boils. She would not suffer even her spiritual daughters to bear her old body. But under one of her arms the swelling grew at last as big as an apple, and under her chin too boils broke out, and waxed huge and blood red, and at last turned black. She suffered unbearable pains from them, and burned with fever. But as often as her mind was clear, she lay there a pattern of holy patience, sighing to God for forgiveness of her sins, and praying in fair and heartfelt words for her cloister and her daughters, for all sick and sorrowful, and for the salvation of all souls that now must part from here. Even Sira Eilif wept when he had given her the viaticum, and his steadfastness, as well as his unwearied zeal in the midst of all this misery, had been a thing to wonder at. Lady Runhild had many times already given her soul into God's keeping, and prayed him to take the nuns into his ward. And then at last the boils on her body began to burst. But this proved a turning towards life, not death. And after, too, folk thought that they saw that those whom the sickness smote with boils were sometimes healed. But those to whom it came with a bloody vomit, they died, every one. It seemed as though the nuns took new courage from the abbess's steadfastness, and from the having seen one stricken with the pest who yet did not die. They had now to milk and tend the byres themselves, to make ready their own food, and themselves fetch home juniper and fresh pine branches to burn for cleansing smoke. Each one had to do what came to her hand. They cared for the sick as best they could, and doled out remedies. They had run out of theriac and calamus root. They dealt round ginger, pepper, saffron and vinegar to ward off the poison, and milk and meat. The bread too gave out, and they baked at night. The spices gave out, and folk must needs chew juniper berries and pine needles against the infection. One by one the sisters drooped and died. Passing bells rang from the cloister church and the parish church early and late in the heavy air, for the strange uncanny mist still lay upon the land. There seemed to be a secret privacy between the fog and the deadly sickness. Sometimes it turned to a frosty fog and sifted down in small ice needles and a half-frozen drizzle, and the land grew white with rime. Then came mild weather and mist again. Folk thought it a sign of evil omen that the seafowl, that else were wont to flock in thousands along the creek that runs inland from the fjord and lies like a river between the low stretches of meadow, but widens to a saltwater lake north of Rhine Cloister, that they suddenly vanished, and in their stead came ravens in countless numbers. On every stone by the waterside the black birds sat amidst the fog, making their hideous croaking, while flocks of crows, so huge that no one before had seen the like, settled on all the woods and groves, and flew with ugly screechings over the stricken land. Now and again Kristin thought of her own, the sons who were scattered so far and wide, the grandchildren she would never see. Little Erland's golden head wavered before her sight. but they were grown to seem far off and pale to her. Almost it seemed as though all mankind in this time of need were alike near to each other and alike far apart. And then she had her hands full all day long. It stood her in good stead now that she was used to all kinds of work. While she sat milking, she would suddenly find beside her little starving children she had never before seen. And she would scarce remember to ask where they were or how things were with them at home. She would give them some food and lead them to the shelter of the chapter hall or some other place where a fire was burning, then stow them away in a bed in the dormitory. She saw with a kind of wonder that in this time of calamity, when more than ever there was need that all should be vigilant in prayer, she scarce ever found time to meditate or to pray. She would fling herself down in the church before the tabernacle when she found a vacant moment, but nothing came of it but wordless sighs and paternosters and aves uttered by rote. She herself didn't know that the nun-like ways and bearing she had fallen into in these 2 years were dropping from her more and more, and that she was growing more like to the housewife of the old days. As the flock of nuns dwindled, the round of cloister duties fell into disarray, and the abbess still lay in bed, weak and with half-palsied tongue. And the work grew more and more for the few that were left to do it. One day she learned by chance the school was still in Nidaros. His shipfolk were dead or fled away, and he had not been able to get new people. He was still well, but he had plunged into wild living, as had many young men in this desperate pass. For him who was afraid, death was sure, they said, and so they deadened thought with drink and riot, gambled and danced and wantoned with women. Even honourable burghers' wives and young maids of the best kindreds ran from their homes in this evil time. In company with the women of the bordels they caroused in the inns and taverns amongst the wildest men. God forgive them, thought the mother. But it was as though her heart were too weary to sorrow much for these things. But in the countryside too, for sure, there was enough of sin and distraction. They heard little of it at the cloister, for there they had no time for much talk. But Sigrid Undset, who went about everywhere, without rest or respite to the sick and the dying, said one day to Kristin that the folks' souls stood in yet direr need than their bodies. There came an evening when they were sitting round the chimney place in the convent hall, the little flock of folk that were left alive in Rhine cloister. 4 nuns and 2 lay sisters, an old stable man and a half-grown boy, 2 beadswomen and some children huddled together around the fire. On the high-seat bench, where a great crucifix gleamed in the dusk on the light-hued wall, lay the abbess, and Sister Kristin and Sister Turid sat at her hands and feet. It was 9 days since the last death among the sisters, and 5 days since any had died in the cloister or the nearby houses. The pestilence seemed to be lessening throughout the parish too, said Sigrid Undset. And for the first time for nearly 3 months, something like a gleam of peace and hope and comfort fell upon the silent and weary folk that sat together there. Old Sister Torun Marta let her rosary sink upon her lap, and took the hand of the little girl who stood at her knee. "What can it be she means? Ah, child, now it seems as though we should see that never for long does God's mother Mary turn away her loving kindness from her children. No, 'tis not Mary Virgin, Sister Torun, 'tis hell. She will go out from this parish with both rake and broom, when they offer up a man without blemish at the graveyard gate. Tomorrow she will be far away." "What does she mean?" asked the nun again uneasily. "Fie upon you, Mannhild! What ugly heathenish talk is this? 'Twere fit ye should taste the birch." "Tell us what it is, Mannhild, Have no fear." Sister Kristin was standing behind them. She asked the question breathlessly. She had remembered. She had heard in her youth from Lady Ashild of dreadful, unnameably sinful devices that the devil tempts desperate men to practice. The children had been down in the grove by the parish church in the falling dusk, and some of the boys had strayed through the wood to a turf hut that stood there, and had eavesdropped and heard some men in it laying plans. It seemed from what they heard that these men had laid hold on a little boy, Tor, the son of Steinunn that lived by the strand, and tonight they were to offer him up to the pest ogress Hel. The children talked eagerly, proud that the grown-up folk were paying attention to what they said. They did not seem to think of pitying the hapless Tor, maybe because he was somewhat of an outcast. He wandered about the parish begging, but never came to the cloister. And if Sira Eilif or any sent by the abbess sought out his mother, she ran away, or she kept a stubborn silence, whether they spoke lovingly or harshly to her. She had lived in the stews of Nidaros for 10 years, but then a sickness took hold on her, and left her looking so ugly that at last she could not win her livelihood in the same way she had used to do. So she had forsaken the town for the Rhine parish, and now dwelt in a hut down by the strand. It still happened at times that a chance beggar or some such stroller would take lodging with her for a while. Who the father was to her boy, she herself did not know. "We must go there," said Kristin. "We cannot sit here, I am sure, while christened souls sell themselves to the devil at our very doors." The nuns whimpered in fear. These were the worst men in the parish, rough, ungodly fellows, and uttermost need and despair must have turned them now into very devils. Had Sira Eilif only been at home, they moaned. In this time of trial, the priest had so won their trust that they thought he could do all things. Kristin wrung her hands. "Even if I must go alone. My mother, have I your leave to go there?" The abbess gripped her by the arm so hard that she cried out. The old tongue-tied woman got to her feet. By signs she made them understand that they should dress her to go out, and called for her golden cross, the badge of her office, and her staff. Then she took Kristin by the arm, for she was the youngest and strongest of the women. All the nuns stood up and followed. Through the door of the little room between the chapter hall and the choir of the church, they went forth into the raw, cold winter night. Lady Runhill's teeth began to chatter, and her whole frame to shiver. She still sweated without cease by reason of her sickness, and the pest-boil sores were not fully healed, so that it must have caused her great agony to walk. But she muttered angrily and shook her head when the sisters asked her to return, clung the harder to Kristin's arm, and plodded, shaking with cold, on before them through the garden. As their eyes grew used to the darkness, the women made out the dim sheen of the withered leaves strewn on the path beneath their feet, and the faint light from the clouded sky above the naked treetops. Cold drops of water dripped from the branches, and puffs of wind went by with a faint sighing sound. The roll of the waves on the strand behind the high ground came to them in dull, heavy sighs. At the bottom of the garden was a little wicket. The sisters shuddered when the bolt, fast rusted in its socket, shrieked as Kristin withdrew it by main force. Then they crept onward through the grove down towards the parish church. Now they could see dimly the black tarred mass, darker against the darkness, and against the opening in the clouds above the low hills beyond the lake, they saw the rooftop and the ridge turret with its beasts' heads and cross over all. There were folk in the graveyard. They felt rather than saw or heard it, and now a faint gleam of light was to be seen low down, as of a lantern set upon the ground. Close by it, the darkness seemed to be moving. The nuns pressed together, moaning almost soundlessly amid whispered prayers, went a few steps, halted and listened, and went on again. They were nearly come to the graveyard gate. Then they heard from out of the dark a thin child voice crying, "Oh, my bannock! You've thrown dirt on it." Kristin let go the abbess's arm and ran forward through the churchyard gate. She pushed aside some dark shapes of men's backs, stumbled over heaps of upturned earth, and then was at the edge of the open grave. She went down on her knees, bent over and lifted up the little boy who stood at the bottom, still whimpering, because the dirt had spoiled the good bannock he had been given for staying quietly down there. The men stood there, frightened from their wits, ready to fly. Some stamped about on the same spot. Kristin saw their feet in the light from the lantern on the ground. Then one, she was sure he would have sprung at her. At the same moment the grey-white nuns' dresses came into sight, and the knot of men hung wavering. Kristin had the boy in her arms still. He was crying for his bannock, so she set him down, took the bread, and brushed it clean. There it is. Eat it. Your bannock is as good as ever now. And now, you men, go home." The shaking of her voice forced her to stop a little. "Go home and thank God you were saved from doing a deed it were hard to atone for." She was speaking now as a mistress speaks to her serving folk, mildly, but as if it could not have crossed her mind that they would not obey. Unwittingly some of the men turned toward the gate. Then one of them shrieked, Stay a little. Don't you see? Our lives at the least are forfeit, perhaps everything we own, now that these full-fed monks' whores have stuck their noses into it. They must never come away from here to spread the tidings of it." Not a man moved, but Sister Agnes broke into a shrill shriek and cried in a wailing voice, "Oh, I thank you, Jesus, that thou sufferest thy handmaidens to die for the glory of thy name." Lady Runhild pushed roughly behind her, tottered forward, and took up the lantern from the ground. No one moved a hand to hinder her. When she lifted it up, the gold cross on her breast shone out. She stood propped on her staff and slowly turned the light upon the ring about her, nodding a little at each man she looked on. Then she made a sign to Kristin to speak. Kristin said, "Go home, peaceably and quietly, dear brothers. Be sure that the Reverend Mother and these good sisters will be as merciful as their duty to God and the honour of His Church will allow. But stand aside now that we may come forth with this child, and then let each man go his way." The men stood wavering. Then one shrieked out as though in direst need, "Is it not better that one be offered up than that we should all perish? This child here is owned by no one. Christ owns him. It were better we should perish, one and all, than to hurt one of his little ones." But the man who had spoken first shouted again, "Hold your tongue. No more such like words, or I will cram them back down your throat with this." He shook his knife in the air. "Go home. Go to your beds, and pray to your priest to comfort you, and say nothing of this. Or I will tell you, in Satan's name, you shall learn it was the worst thing you ever did to put your fingers into our affairs. You need not cry so loud for him you name to hear you, Auntor. You can be sure he is not far from here," said Kristin calmly. And some of the men seemed afraid, and pressed unwittingly nearer to the abbess, who stood holding the lantern. The worst had been, both for us and for you, had we sat quiet at home, while you went about here making a dwelling place in hottest hell." But the man Antor swore and raved. Kristin knew that he hated the nuns, for his father had been forced to pledge his farm to them when he had to pay amends for manslaying and incest with his wife's cousin. Now he went on, casting up at the sisters all the enemy's most hateful lies, charging them with sins so black and unnatural that only the devil himself could prompt a man to think such thoughts. The poor nuns bowed themselves, terrified and weeping under the hail of his taunts. But they stood fast around their old mother, and she held the lantern high, throwing the light upon the man, and looking him calmly in the face while he raved. But anger flamed up in Kristin like new kindled fire. "Silence! Have you lost your wits, or has God smitten you with blindness? Should we dare to murmur under his chastisement? We who have seen his consecrated brides go forth to meet the sword that has been drawn by reason of the world's sins? They watched and prayed while we sinned, and each day forgot our Maker. They shut themselves from the world within the citadel of prayer, while we scoured the world, driven by greed of great and small possessions, of our own lusts and of our own wrath. But they came forth to us when the angel of death was sent out amongst us. They gathered in the sick and the defenceless and the hungry. 12 of our sisters have died in this plague. You know that. Not one of them turned aside, and not one of them stopped praying for us all in sisterly love, till their tongues dried in their mouths, and their life's blood ebbed away. You speak bravely of yourself and your like." "I am your like," she cried, beside herself with anger. "I am not one of these holy sisters. I am one of you." "You have grown full humble, woman," said Antor scornfully. "You are scared, I see that well. A little more, and you'll be more than happy to call the mother to this boy your like. That must God judge. He died both for her and for me, and he knows us both. Where is she, Steinun?" "Go down to her hut. You will find her there, sure enough," answered Antor. "Ah, truly, someone must send word to the poor woman that we have her boy," said Kristin to the nuns. "We must go out to her tomorrow." Antor gave a jeering laugh, but another man cried uneasily, "No, she is dead," he said to Kristin. "It is 14 days since Bjarne left her and barred the door. She lay in the death throes then." "She lay in—" Kristin gazed at the men, horror-struck. "Was there no one to fetch a priest to her? Is the body lying there, and no one has had so much compassion on her as to bring her to hallowed ground? And her child, you would have—" At the sight of the woman's horror, it was as though the men went clean beside themselves with fear and shame. All were shouting at once. A voice louder than all the rest rang out. "Fetch her yourself, sister." "Aye, that will I. Who of you will go with me?" No one answered. Antor cried, "You'll have to go alone, I think." "Tomorrow, as soon as it is light, we will fetch her, Antor. I myself will buy her a resting place and masses for her soul." "Go now. Go tonight. Then I will believe that you nuns are choke-full of holiness and purity." Antor had stuck his head forward close to hers. Kristin drove her clenched fist into his face with a single loud sob of rage and horror. Lady Ragnhild went forward and placed herself at Kristin's side. She strove to bring forth some words. The nuns cried out that tomorrow the dead woman should be brought to her grave. But the devil seemed to have turned Antor's brain. He went on shrieking, "Go now! Then we will believe on God's mercy." Kristin drew herself up, white and stiff. "I will go." She lifted the child and gave it into Sister Torun's arms, pushed the men aside and ran quickly, stumbling over grass tussocks and heaps of earth, towards the gate, while the nuns followed, wailing, and Sister Agnes cried out that she would go with her. The abbess shook her clenched hands towards Kristin, beckoning her to stop, but she seemed quite beside herself and gave no heed. Suddenly there was a great commotion in the dark over by the graveyard gate. The next moment Sira Eilif's voice asked, "Who was holding Thing here?" He came forward into the glimmer of the lantern. They saw that he bore an axe in his hand. The nuns flocked around him. The men tried to steal away in the dark, but in the gateway they were met by a man bearing a drawn sword in his hand. There was some turmoil and the clash of arms, and Sira Eilif shouted towards the gate, "Woe to any who broke the churchyard peace." Kristin heard one say it was the strong smith from Credo Lane. The moment after, a tall, broad-shouldered, white-haired man appeared at her side. It was Ulf Haldarsson. The priest handed him the axe. He had borrowed it from Ulf, and took the boy Tor from the nun, while he said, "'Tis past midnight already. Nonetheless, it were best you all came with me to the church. I must get to the bottom of these doings this very night." No one had any thought but to obey. But when they were come out onto the road, one of the light grey women's forms stepped aside from the throng and turned off by the path through the wood. The priest called out, bidding her come on with the others. Kristin's voice answered from the darkness. She was some way along the track already. I cannot come, Sira Eilif, till I have kept my promise." The priest and some others sprang after her. She was standing leaning against the fence when Sira Eilif came up with her. She was fearfully white in the face, but when he looked into her eyes, he saw that she was not gone mad, as at first he had feared. "Come home, Kristin," he said. "Tomorrow we will go there with you, some men, and I myself will go with you." "I have given my word. I cannot go home, Sira Eilif, till I have done that which I vowed to do." The priest stood silent a little. Then he said in a low voice, "Perhaps you are right. Go then, sister, in God's name." Like a shadow, Kristin melted away into the darkness, which swallowed up her grey form. When Ulf Haldarsson came up by her side, she said, she spoke by snatches vehemently, "Go back! I didn't ask you to come with me." Ulf laughed low. "Kristin, you have not learnt yet, I see, that some things can be done without your asking or bidding. Nor, though you have seen it many a time, I think, that you cannot always carry through alone all that you take upon you. But this burden of yours I will help you to carry." The pine woods sighed above them, and the boom of the rollers away on the strand came stronger or more faint as the gusts of wind rose or died away. They walked in pitch darkness. After a while Ulf said, "I have borne you company before, Kristin, when you went out at night. Perhaps it were but fitting I should go with you this time too." She breathed hard and heavily in the dark. Once she stumbled over something, and Ulf caught her. After that he took her hand and led her. In a while the man heard that she was weeping as she went, and he asked her why she wept. "I weep to think of how good
and faithful you have been to us, Ulf, all our days. What can I say? I know well enough it was mostly for Erland's sake, but almost I believe, kinsman. All our days you have judged of me more kindly than you had a right to, after what you first saw of my doings. I loved you, Kristin, no less than him.
He was silent. Kristin felt that he was strongly stirred. Then he said, "Therefore, I think, it was a hard errand when I sailed out to you today. I came to bring you such tidings as I myself thought it hard to bear. God strengthen you, Kristin."
"Is it Skule?"
asked Kristin softly in a little.
"Skule is dead?"
"No. Skule was well when I spoke with him yesterday, and now not many are dying in the town. But I had news from Tautra this morning." He heard her sigh heavily once, but she said nothing. A little after he said, "'Tis 10 days now since they died. There are but 4 brothers left alive in the cloister, and the island is all but swept clean of people." They were come now where the wood ended. Over the flat stretch of land in front, the roaring of the sea and the wind came to meet them. One spot out on the dark shone white, the surf in a little bay by a steep, light-hued sandhill.
"She dwells there,"
said Kristin. Ulf felt that long, convulsive shudders went through her frame. He gripped her hand hard. "You took this on yourself. Remember that, and don't lose your wits now." Kristin said in a strangely thin, clear voice that the blast caught and bore away, "Now will Björgulf's dream come true. I trust in God's and Mary's grace." Ulf tried to see her face, but it was too dark. They were walking on the strand now. In some places it was so narrow under the bluffs that now and then a wave washed right up to their feet. They tramped forward over tangled heaps of seaweed and great stones. After a while they were aware of a dark hump in against the sandy bank. "Stay here," said Ulf shortly. He went forward and thrust against the door. Then she heard him hew at the withy bands and thrust at the door again. Then she was aware that the door had fallen inwards and he had gone in through the black hole. It was not a night of heavy storm, but it was so dark that Kristin could see nothing save the little flashes of foam that came and vanished the same instant on the lifting sea, and the shining of the waves breaking along the shores of the bay, and against the sand dunes she could make out that black hump. And it seemed to her that she was standing in a cavern of light, and that it was the forecourt of death. The roll of breaking waves and the hiss of their waters ebbing among the stones of the beach kept time with the blood waves surging through her, though all the time it was as though her body must shiver in pieces, as a vessel of wood falls apart in staves. Her breast ached as if something would burst it in sunder from within. Her head felt hollow and empty, and as it were rifted, and the unceasing wind wrapped her round and swept clean through her. She felt, with a strange listlessness, that she herself had surely caught the sickness now. But it was as though she saw that the darkness would be riven by a great light, that would drown the roar of the sea in its thunder, and that in the horror of this she would perish. She drew up her hood, blown back from her head by the wind, wrapped the black nun's cloak close about her, and stood with her hands crossed beneath it. But it did not come into her thought to pray. It was as though her soul had more than enough to do, to work a way forth from its mansion trembling to its fall, and as though it tore at her breast with every breath. She saw a light flare up within the hut. A little after, Ulf Haldarsson called out to her. "You must come hither and hold the light for me, Kristin." He was standing at the doorway. As she came, he gave her a torch of some tarred wood. A choking stench from the corpse met her, though the hut was draughty and the door was gone. With staring eyes and mouth half open, and she felt her jaws and lips grow stiff and wooden, she looked round for the dead. But there was nothing to see but a long bundle lying in the corner on the earthen floor, wrapped in Ulf's cloak. He had torn loose some long planks from somewhere and laid the door upon them. Cursing his unhandy tools, he made notches and holes with his light axe and dagger, and strove to lash the door fast to the boards. Once or twice he looked up at her swiftly, and each time his dark grey-bearded face grew more hard-set. "I wonder much how you had thought to get through this piece of work alone," he said as he worked, then glanced up at her. But the stiff, death-like face in the red gleam of the tar brand was set and unmoved as ever. It was the face of a dead woman, or of one distraught. "Can you tell me that, Kristin?" He laughed harshly, but still it was of no avail. "I think now is the time for you to say a prayer." Stiff and lifeless as ever, she began to speak. "Pater noster, qui es in caelis, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua sicut in caelo et in terra." Then she came to a stop. Ulf looked at her. Then he took up the prayer. "Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie." Swiftly and firmly he said the Lord's Prayer to the end, went over and made the sign of the cross over the bundle. Swiftly and firmly he took it up and bore it to the bier that he had fashioned. "You go in front," he said. "Maybe it is somewhat heavier, but you will smell the stench less there. Throw away the torch, we can see more surely without it. And make sure you don't stumble, Kristin, for I had rather not to take hold of this poor body any more." The struggling pain in her breast seemed to rise in revolt when she got the beer pole set upon her shoulders. Her chest would not bear up the weight. But she set her teeth hard. So long as they went along the strand where the wind blew strong, only a little of the corpse smell came to her. "Here I must draw it up first, I think, and the beer after," said Ulf, when they were come to the steep slope they had climbed down. "We can go on a little farther," said Kristin. "'Tis there they come down with the seaweed sleighs. It is not steep." She spoke calmly, the man heard, and was in her right mind. And a fit of sweating and trembling took him, now it was over. He had thought she must lose her wits tonight. They struggled forward along the sandy track that led across the flat towards the pine wood. The wind swept in freely here, yet it was not as it had been down on the strand, and as they drew farther and farther away from the roar of the beach, she felt it as a home-faring from the horror of utter darkness. Beside their path the ground showed lighter. It was a cornfield, but there had been no one to reap it. The scent of it and the sight of the beaten-down straw welcomed her home again, and her eyes filled with tears of sisterly pity. Out of her own desolate terror and woe, she was coming home to fellowship with the living and the dead. At times when the wind was right behind, the fearful carrion stench enwrapped her wholly, but yet it was not so awful as when she had stood in the hut, for the night was full of fresh, wet, cold, cleansing streams of air. And much stronger than the feeling that she bore a thing of dread upon the bier behind her was the thought that Ulf Haldarsson was there, guarding her back against the black and living horror they were leaving behind, and whose roar sounded fainter and more faint. When they were come to the edge of the pine woods, they were aware of lights. "They are coming to meet us," said Ulf. Soon after they were met by a whole throng of men bearing pine-root torches, a couple of lanterns, and a bier covered with a pall. Sigrid Undset was with them, and Kristin saw with wonder that in the troop were many of the men who had been that same night in the churchyard, and that many of them were weeping. When they lifted the burden from her shoulders, she almost fell. Sigrid Undset would have caught a hold of her, but she said quickly, "Touch me not. Don't come near me. I have the pest myself. I feel it." But nonetheless Sigrid Undset stayed her up with a hand below her arm. "Then be of good cheer, woman, remembering that our Lord has said, 'Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren or sisters, ye have done it unto me.'" Kristin gazed at the priest. Then she looked across to where the men were shifting the body from the stretcher that Ulf had fashioned to the bier they had brought. Ulf's cloak slipped aside a little. The point of a worn-out shoe stuck out, dark wet in the light of the torches. Kristin went across, kneeled between the poles of the bier, and kissed the shoe. "God be gracious to you, sister. God give your soul joy in his light. God look in his mercy on us here in our darkness." Then it seemed to her, as it were, life itself that tore its way from out of her, a grinding, inconceivable pain, as though something within her, rooted fast in every outermost fibre of her limbs, were riven loose. All that was within her breast was torn out. She felt her throat full of it, her mouth filled with blood that tasted of salt and foul copper. Next moment her whole dress in front was a glistening wet blackness. "Jesus, is there so much blood in an old woman?" she thought. Ulf Halldorson lifted her in his arms and bore her away. At the gate of the cloister, the nuns, bearing lighted candles, came to meet the train of men. Already Kristin scarce had her full senses, but she felt that she was half borne, half helped through the door, and was aware of the whitewashed vaulted room filled with the flickering light of yellow candle flames and red pine torches, and of the tramp of feet rolling like a sea. But to the dying woman the light was like the shimmer of her own dying life flame, and the footfalls on the flags as the rushing of the rivers of death rising up to meet her. Then the candlelight spread out in a wider space. She was once again under the open murky sky. In the courtyard, the flickering light played on a grey stone wall with heavy buttresses and high tall windows. The church. She was borne in someone's arms. It was Ulf again. But now he seemed to take on for her the semblance of all who had ever borne her up. When she laid her arms about his neck and pressed her cheek against his stubbly throat, it was as though she were a child again with her father, but also as though she were clasping a child to her own bosom. And behind his dark head there were red lights, and they seemed like the glow of the fire that nourishes all love. A little later she opened her eyes, and her mind was clear and calm. She was sitting, propped up, in a bed in the dormitory. A nun with a linen band over her lower face stood bending over her. She noticed the smell of vinegar. It was Sister Agnes, she knew by her eyes, and the little red wart she had on her forehead. And now it was day. Clear grey light was sifting into the room from the little glass window. She had no great pain now. She was but wet through with sweat, woefully worn and weary, and her breast stung and smarted when she breathed. Greedily she drank down a soothing drink that Sister Agnes held to her mouth. But she was cold. Kristin lay back on the pillows, and now she remembered everything that had happened the night before. The wild dream fantasies were wholly gone. Her wits must have wandered a little, she understood. But it was good that she had got this thing done, had saved the little boy, and prevented those poor folk from burdening their souls with such a hideous deed. She knew she had need to be overjoyed, that she had been given grace to do this thing just before she was to die. And yet she could not rejoice, as was meet she should. It was a more quiet content she felt, as when she lay in her bed at home at Yorengard, tired out after a day's work well done. And she must thank Ulf too. She had spoken his name, and he must have been sitting hidden away by the door and heard her, for here he came across the room and stood before her bed. She reached out her hand to him, and he took and pressed it with a firm clasp. Suddenly the dying woman grew restless. Her hands fumbled under the folds of linen about her throat. "What is it, Kristin?" asked Ulf. "The cross," she whispered, and painfully drew forth her father's gilded cross. It had come to her mind that yesterday she had promised to make a gift for the soul's weal of that poor Steinan. She had not remembered then that she had no possessions on earth any more. She owned nothing that she could give, saving the cross she had had of her father, and then her bridal ring. She wore that on her finger still. She drew it off and gazed at it. It lay heavy in her hand. It was pure gold, set with great red stones. Erland, she thought, and it came upon her now it were like her she should give this away. She didn't know why, but it seemed that she ought. She shut her eyes in pain and held it out to Ulf. "Who would you like to give this to?" he asked low, and as she did not answer, "Do you mean I should give it to school?" Kristin shook her head, her eyes tight closed. "Steinun, I promised masses for her." She opened her eyes and sought with them the ring where it lay in the smith's dusky palm, and her tears burst forth in a swift stream. For it seemed to her that never before had she understood to the full what it meant. The life that ring had wed her to, that she had complained against, had murmured at, had raged at and defied. None the less she had loved it so, joyed in it so, both in good days and evil, that not one day had there been when it would not have seemed hard to give it back to God, nor one grief that she could have forgone without regret. Ulf and the nun changed some words that she could not hear, and he went from the room. Kristin would have lifted her head to dry her eyes, but she could not. The hand lay motionless on her breast, and now the pain within was sore. Her hand felt so heavy, and it seemed as though the ring were on her finger still. Her head began to grow unclear again. She must see if it were true that the ring was gone, that she had not only dreamed she had given it away. And now, too, she began to grow uncertain. All that had happened last night, the child in the grave, the black sea with its swift little flashing waves, the corpse she had borne. She didn't know whether she had dreamed it all or had been awake, and she had no strength to open her eyes. "Sister," said the nun, "you must not sleep now. Ulf is gone to fetch a priest for you." Kristin woke up fully again with a start and fixed her eyes upon her hand. The gold ring was gone, that was sure enough. But there was a white worn mark, where it had been on her middle finger. It showed forth quite clearly on the rough brown flesh, like a scar of thin white skin, and she thought she could make out 2 round spots on either side where the rubies had been, and something like a little mark, an M, where the middle plate of gold had been pierced with the first letter of Mary Virgin's holy name. And the last clear thought that formed in her brain was that she should die before this mark had time to vanish, and she was glad. It seemed to her to be a mystery that she could not fathom, but which she knew most surely nonetheless, that God had held her fast in a covenant made for her without her knowledge, by a love poured out upon her richly, and in despite of her self-will, in despite of her heavy earth-bound spirit, somewhat of this love had become part of her, had wrought in her like sunlight in the earth, had brought forth increase which not even the hottest flames of fleshly love, nor its wildest bursts of wrath, could lay waste wholly. A handmaiden of God had she been. A wayward, unruly servant, oftenest an eye-servant in her prayers and faithless in her heart, slothful and neglectful, impatient under correction, but little constant in her deeds. Yet had he held her fast in his service, and under the glittering golden ring a mark had been set secretly upon her, showing that she was his handmaid, owned by the Lord and King who was now coming, born by the priest's anointed hands, to give her freedom and salvation. Soon after Sigrid Undset had given her the last oil and viaticum, Kristin Lavransdatter again lost the knowledge of everything around her. She lay in the sway of sore fits of blood vomiting and burning fever, and the priest who stayed by her told the nuns that it was like to go quickly with her. Once or twice the dying woman came so far to herself that she knew one or other of the faces. Sigrid Undset's, the sisters. Lady Runhild herself was there once, and Ulf too she saw. She strove to show she knew them, and she felt it was good they should be by her, and wished her well. But to those who stood around, it seemed as though she were but fighting with her hands in the throes of death. Once she saw Munan's face. Her little son peeped in at her through a half-opened door. Then he drew back his head, and the mother lay gazing at the door, if, perchance, the boy might peep out again. But instead, Lady Runhild came and wiped her face with a wet cloth, and that too was good. And then all things were lost in a dark red mist, and a roar that first grew fearsomely, but then it died away little by little, and the red mist grew thinner and lighter. And at last it was like a fair morning mist before the sun breaks through. And all sound ceased, and she knew that now she was dying. Sigrid Undset and Ulf Haldarsson went out together from the room of death. In the doorway out to the cloister yard they stopped short. Snow had fallen. No one had marked it of them who sat by the woman while she fought with death. The white gleam from the steep church roof over against the 2 men was strangely dazzling. The tower shone white against the ash-grey sky. The snow lay so fine and white on all the window mouldings, and all buttresses and jutting points against the church's walls of grey-hewn stone. And it was as though the 2 men lingered because they were reluctant to break with their footprints the thin coverlid of new-fallen snow. They drank in the air. After the noisome smell that always fills the sick room of one pest-stricken, it tasted sweet, cool, and as it were a little thin and empty. But it seemed as though this snowfall must have washed the air clean of all poison and pestilence. It was as good as fresh spring water. The bell in the tower began to ring again. The 2 looked up to where it swung behind the belfry bars. Small grains of snow, loosened from the tower roof as it shook, rolled down and grew to little balls, leaving spots where the black of the shingles showed through. "This snow will scarce lie," said Ulf. "No, it will melt perhaps before evening," answered the priest. There were pale golden rifts in the clouds, and a faint gleam of sunshine fell, as it were, provingly across the snow. The men stood still. Then Ulf Haldarsson said low, "I am thinking, Sire Eilif, I will give some land to the church here, and a beaker of Labrans Bjorgulfsson's that she gave me, to found a mass for her, and my foster sons, and for him, Erland, my kinsman." The priest answered without looking at the man, "Perhaps, too, you want to show your thankfulness to him who led you hither yesterday. You may be well content, I think, that it was granted to you to help her through tonight." "Aye, it was that I thought of," said Ulf Haldarsson. Then he laughed a little. "And now, could I well nigh repent me, priest, that I have been so meek a man towards her." "No point wasting your time in such vain regrets," answered the priest. "What do you mean?" "I mean a man should only repent his sins," said the priest. "Why so?" "Because none is good saving God only, and we can do no good save with his help. So there is no point repenting a good deed, Ulf, for the good you have done cannot be undone, and though all the hills should crash in ruin, yet would it stand." Well, I don't understand these things, Sire. I am tired. And hungry too, probably. You must come with me to the kitchen house, Ulf, said the priest. No thanks. I have no stomach for eating after tonight, said Ulf Haldarsson. Nonetheless, you must go with me and eat, said Sire Eilif. He laid his hand on Ulf's sleeve and led him along with him. They went out into the courtyard and down towards the kitchen house. Unwittingly, both men trod as lightly and carefully as they could upon the new fallen snow. The end. You have been listening to Kristin Lavransdatter by Sigrid Undset. Read by Ross Brownscombe.